Good. So you know now what were the things that you were supposed to read. So let's get straight to it. So I have some interesting thing. Usually when I'm teaching these classes, what I try to do is that I expect you all to complete the reading. So here are the readings that you were supposed to do for this one, which is the very basics of CSS. And on top of that, also the main concept in here in the core modules. So, but one of the things I wanted to show you on how you can use AI for learning these things is that I actually went into GitHub Copilot on my VS Code and then gave it this link. And since my slides are actually made on a website, I gave it like this prompt that you see in there in the tooltip saying like, please read this URL and then propose some useful slides for the class. And this was with a combination of Copilot and Cloud Sonnet 4. Okay, so remember in this class you can use AI, but you always have to disclose it and share what are the prompts that you're using. And we are going to be seeing like what are the results it produced. Again, remember only to use this type of things when you can validate the result. In this case, since I already have read this and I know all of these materials, then I know that it's producing something that could be useful. So here we go. However, the most important one is for you to actually go and complete the readings and make sure that you understand all of the elements. So from the basics, the most important thing that you have to understand is that all of these that you see in here is what we call a CSS rule, okay? And then that CSS rule, it's composed by a selector, and that selector, after that, you have a curly brackets, which is a block, and in that block, you're going to have property, colon, value, and then semicolon, okay? And when you go and see an actual example, and then of course I blanked everything, it will be looking something like this. This is the CSS selector, which in this case is just selecting a regular H1, which is a header. And then in the body of the CSS, I have the property and the value. It is very important that you learn the names of all of these things, because when you're looking for help, even if it is for asking on an LLM, then you need to know what are you be calling for. Like for instance, you can go and say, what are the different properties that I can change on an SVG circle or something like that, or a paragraph or whatever, or what are the different values I can give to a flexbox or something like that. Okay, so um, after doing something like that, it is very important that once you created your HTML and you want to append your CSS, there are going to be three ways that you can append them, at least, I guess. So the most important one, and the one that we are going to be using in this class, is the external method. So basically the whole idea is that you create a separate CSS file and then add it to your HTML. Then you can also use an internal method, in which case basically you just put a style tag inside the head of your HTML. And finally, you could also append CSS inline, which means as an attribute of the or the attribute style of any element. So basically try to avoid these two. This is the one that we are going to be using in the class, only the external. So make sure that every project that you're submitting conforms to that, okay? So when you're doing it with external, remember this goes in as part of your head of the HTML body. So, and whatever you put in there, it is actually going to be loaded before the page is rendered. So whenever your CSS contains things that controls how the page is rendered, it's important that you put that in there. There are some attributes that you can use for modifying that, but that's the most important thing. So, and the style CSS, it is just going to contain something like that. Make sure that whatever file you choose is going to be accessible and in the correct folder. Many times it can be like a local folder or things like that. So having said that, like let's talk about these different CSS selectors. The most basic one that you're going to find is something like this. Again, CSS selector. In this case, we are selecting all of the P elements in the DOM, which is the document object manipulator, which is a tree structure for the HTML. And then for that one, I want to change the color. In this case, this controls the color of the font, and I'm going to change the color of the font to be green, if I'm not mistaken. Then there you also have another option, which is this one, in which you say, I want to change all like this attribute for either an H1 or an H2 or an H3. So whenever you use the comma, it's going to be an or, okay? Now, whenever you want to apply something that goes beyond just the regular element, you can also use an attribute class. And for classes, whenever you go and say the class for this is special, then you just go and say dot special. And the dot is the operator that you use with that. It's very important. You can combine the dot with, for instance, the tag element. So if you want to select this specific one and only the special only for paragraphs, then you can just say p dot special, okay? You cannot say special p because there wouldn't be a way of separating the special from the p. It will be still be looking at as a string, but you can combine this one or with the next one or pretty much with any of the other ones that you're going to see, like for instance the ID. So if you want to select with an ID, it is going to be with the hashtag, and the hashtag is going to be selecting the header in this case, okay? So for classes, use dot. For IDs, use hashtag. And whenever you do this, take also into account that it is not going to be throwing an error, but it's a good practice that you only identify one element with the same ID, whereas you can actually use class for identifying multiple elements. Actually, the way you use the class is usually you say, this is a different class of paragraphs or a type of paragraphs. Whereas the ID, you use it for very specific elements and say only that one. You could still apply it to multiple, but it's not going to show us an error, but it's not a good practice. So and I think it might be breaking on one of the standards or something. Now, once you have done those, and you can have the regular tags and then IDs and classes, you can also go and start specifying depending on the sentence. So if you just use a space between two tags, like for instance, in this case, this is going to be an emphasis inside a list item. That means, and this is inside, it doesn't matter if it is 2 levels deep or 3 levels deep, then apply that element, or for any paragraph that it's inside a container, I want to give it a margin button, something like that. Apart from that, you can also use the adjacent sibling selector, which is going to be the plus sign, as you can see in here. And basically, this one is saying the first paragraph that goes after an H1, or every paragraph that goes after the H1 should have these attributes, okay? So there you go. Apart from that, you also have some other ones that are more useful for reflecting interactions and things like that. Like for instance, linked, or if it has been visited, or if it has been hovered, or if it is active or not. So this can be useful, for instance, for making sure that the user is very clear on what is the current selection, which is going to be with the active, or hover when I actually pass my mouse over that element. So for instance, if a button, I hover over that, then I want to change the background color to a different color, so the user will know that I'm passing by that. So it could be as an effect. There are other functions that are actually more recent from the CSS standard, like for instance, like the calc function or the calculate, which can be useful for you to compute things like depending to the current size of the screen or things like that. It is actually quite comprehensive, so make sure to check all of those elements. In this case, for instance, like for a container, I'm going to say that is going to be like 100% of the width that it's available, but then subtract to that 50 pixels, okay? So you can also use transform functions, and these are used a lot in visualization, which are going to be doing things like, for instance, take the box and then rotate it or scale it. You can also do that in only one operation. Every time you wanna search what are the different options that I can do, remember, just go and search for MDN. In this case, it will be CSS transform. And let's see what we get in here. So here is an example of all the different things you could do, like scaling, translating, rotating, skewing, or scaling and then translating, etc., etc. Here is the explanation. And we really like the MDN because it tells us if it works in what browsers and the full definition. So this will be kind of like your reference for that. Make sense? You can also use CSS variables or custom properties, as you can see in here, like defining here that I'm going to have like this primary color and this font size, and then just referring for that, which can be especially useful for um, having a value that is reused in multiple parts of your CSS. And this is a feature that used to be available only in CSS preprocessors, but nowadays they have been adding that to the latest versions of the standard. Okay. You can also use shorthand properties, as you can see in here, like for instance, for the padding, instead of having to specify 4 paddings right away, you can just use the padding overall and then pass them one after the other. Or like in this case, something like this, which is going to be applying to top bottom and these ones to left and right, okay? There's also like media queries, which are going to be checking what are the current settings of the display at that moment. And then if that setting it's applying, then it's going to be changing different things. Like for instance, in this case, to try to implement a little bit of responsive design, okay? So for instance, I am going to have a white background. Um, uh, if the screen is large, I think this is what it's doing. And then if it is less than 768, I might be wrong, it's using light blue, okay? Now, one thing that I want to emphasize on this is that I'm going to be going through all of these things, and again, Cloud generate these nice slides. But the only way that you really can learn these things is by doing. So take quick notes, but then try to start thinking on different ways you will apply it, because that's the best way of learning this. If you want to comment out something, you can use /star, and then some best practices, try to use external style sheets, prefer classes over IDs for styling whenever you want to apply to multiple, and write meaningful class names. The IDs actually can be very useful whenever you're using JavaScript to find something to modify it. Use meaningful class names, which means do not call it class 1 or class 2. Instead, go and say this is the container or is the gap or something like that. So it's something more mnemonic. And make sure to group related styles together. That's actually very useful. And of course, use comments to organize your code. And do not use inline styles. One of the reasons for this, and we're going to see that in the specificity, is that it will, like inline styles, override whatever you have in your external styles. They take more precedence to those. So it tends to generate debugging, makes debugging hard, because you are looking at changes on your CSS file, but actually the thing that is modifying things is in your HTML file. So it's a better practice just to keep them separated. And then it is very important that you actually test across different browsers, so you make sure that things are actually working together, because each browser is going to be implementing things in a different way. For the class, we are going to be using Chrome as our main browser. Just keep that in mind, okay?